Good evening. It's such a privilege to be here, and I'm really grateful that you've all come this evening on a really beautiful night to hear this talk. For this positions lecture, I chose a topic that usually gets energies going. Should governments regulate religion? Dr. Graham had told me that this should be at least a little bit juicy, so I tried. And I'm starting from the supposition, as I tackle this question, that modern nation-states are in the business of parsing what is religious and what is not, and busy regulating those boundaries and often assessing the content of religious activity vis-a-vis the rest of social life. But I am hoping to interrogate more deeply the extent and ultimate meaning of that regulation and how it is often done, how it could be done in the modern era. And before I go on, I do want to say just one note about what I mean by modern nation state, because it's useful to periodize the particular form of states that we have today, as they haven't always been that way. I think a lot about China, and indeed both the term China and the Republican form of governance are really recent. The term religion, 宗教, came through Japan initially into China, but only now about 130 years ago. Right? Japan, in its efforts to build a constitution, inherits the categories of religion from Western nations, and that's translated then into the Chinese context, which then, after the fall of the Qing dynasty in 1912, begins to articulate a provisional constitution during the early 20th century, and for the first time begins to use the language of 宗教自由, which means religious freedom. Okay? So when I say modern, I do really mean quite recent in the big span of human history. And so tonight I hope to do three things. First, I want to complicate the religion-state question by sharing some cases spanning from religious establishment to secular establishment type countries that show how messy and really inconclusive efforts to parse the civil or religious have been. Then I'll turn to some classical and contemporary Confucian efforts to envision, I think somewhat at odds with merely technocratic efforts to manage religion, a vision where spiritual and moral exemplarism ideally suffuses the whole of society. And then finally, I'll turn to the scripture and tradition of Christian reflection on conscience, which in many ways relativizes our thinking about the regulatory power of the state, no matter what sort of majority, Christian, non-Christian, secular, might hold sway. So to begin with part one, a lot of contemporary states affirm some notion of religious freedom or its analogs in other religious traditions in their constitution. But what it means in any given case gets puzzling the minute you look at any details. So let's start by considering a couple cases that span from religious establishment to secular establishment type countries. So for example, the UK affirms religious freedom and belief as a human right in the sense of choice, that any citizen can choose what religious community they would like to belong to. But it still does allow the establishment of the state religion. For instance, England still has a state church, the Church of England, with a broader global communion. Yet when you consider the governance of that church, that the head must be the Queen or King of England, and that the Archbishop of Canterbury, the first among equals, must be someone eligible to sit in the English House of Lords, then in a post-colonial world, this gets very dicey. That the highest authorities of the church seem bound to remain from the white royal family and the British Commonwealth citizenry. So it's not clear that the UK's citizen individual freedom to choose a religion gives much leeway for the religious institution itself to choose its own composition. Okay. The US tends to hold up separation of church and state as an ideal, and yet you often see a mix of technical and value-laden principles at work. especially in the cases of religious or cultural minorities, like rulings on Mormon polygamy or Santeria practitioners sacrificing animals. So, for example, the Supreme Court ruled that Santeria practitioners could sacrifice animals in the United States on religious freedom grounds, but also insisted, interestingly, that it had to be done in a humane way in order to avoid animal cruelty. Even though, under the principle of equal protection under the law, courts aim to treat groups neutrally, whether they are this or that religion or none at all, such cases call into question whether state treatment of religious groups is ever really value neutral, unengaged with ethical assessments of the content of religious beliefs and practices. Let's turn to France, where the principle of laïcité, often translated as secularism, stresses the non-establishment of any one tradition. This was a move to bring France into a secular era after the power of the French church in French society. Yet this category hinges on limiting religion to a private rather than a public sphere. So in the last couple of years, we've seen rather odd cases, like this one, where the French state forced Muslim women to strip on the beach in the name of religious freedom, on the grounds that people can wear large religious symbols in private, but not public spaces. And so schools, hospitals, or in this case, the public beach, were considered public spaces where overt large religious symbolism should not appear. And thus we've got to ask whether the public-private dichotomy isn't a somewhat artificial one when it comes to the living of religious traditions, easily used to strip religious groups of any real means for living their religions. Finally, let's turn to the People's Republic of China, where the Constitution affirms that citizens may enjoy a right to religious belief, 宗教自由, and it permits 5 official government-regulated religious bodies in the mainland. These are Buddhism, Taoism, Islam, Protestantism, and Catholicism. Those are the 5 legal traditions on the mainland. Hong Kong is a special case where Confucianism is categorized as a religion in Hong Kong, though it is handled by the Museum Affairs Bureau on the mainland. Even among these sanctioned above-ground communities, the state does not necessarily, though, regard them all on par. The state is highly conscious of the history of foreign imperialism tied to foreign religions. For instance, the notorious French religious protectorate in China that gave Catholics special legal privileges in China, with international French treaties superseding domestic Chinese law in legal cases and conflicts wherever either foreign or Chinese Catholics were involved. This caused deep resentment among the Chinese people about what they felt was the incursion of French civil law into Chinese sovereignty. And since the modern People's Republic of China is an officially atheist state, it sees its job as protecting the Chinese social ecology from that sort of external interference, often using organic metaphors of balance in the religious ecology. While all 5 religions are legal, the government nonetheless regulates in a way to ensure that, quote, native plants, like Chinese religions, are not overtaken by, quote, invasive species, like Christianity. Yet this concern to keep foreign species in check really struggles to account for the passage and the dynamism of history. I just want to share an example from one of the leading sociologists of religion and the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, Mo Zhongjian. And he expresses this concern about the native and the foreign. One reason for the enormous growth of Protestantism in the last 30 years lies in the following circumstance. Previously, the various forms of polytheistic popular belief tended to limit the development of Protestantism. Later, ceaseless efforts were made to stamp out popular religion. Those were by the Chinese state, by the Communist Party in the 20th century. But in this way, religious ecology was thrown out of balance, and obstacles to the vigorous development of Christianity in the sphere of belief were cleared out of the way. One important strategic task for the future social and cultural building up of China is to reestablish, under the guidance of the system of the socialist core values, the equilibrium of a diverse and harmonious ecology of religious culture. So here you see the concern by members of the Communist Party that by wiping out domestic Chinese religions during the late 20th century, they inadvertently cleared the way for these foreign species to take hold in China's religious ecology. So this concern to keep the foreign species in check is a very strong one in the discourse about regulation. And yet we see how it struggles to deal with and account for the dynamism of history, where sometimes formerly foreign religions like Buddhism from India have actually become Chinese over millennia. And today, many Chinese Muslims and many Chinese Christians have been now so for generations, with zero connection to foreign bodies. I note these contemporary examples simply to point out that the politics of the multi-ethnic, multi-religious nation-state have not really figured out how to handle diversity or parse religions in any consistent handling of the tricky cases where the religion question really has the highest stakes. Here in the U.S., you often hear terms like religious freedom or separation of church and state thrown around as though such political and legal principles solve it all, absolving us of any need to get into the weeds of how religious groups are culturally positioned or the theological and ritual details of what they say and do. Yet today, as we see such limitations of the nation-state, and we see its tendency to simply reproduce and formalize patterns of coloniality, majority-minority cultural dominance, racism, nativism, it is all the more important to consider what various wisdom traditions themselves have said about religion and society. So as a scholar who works in the comparative study of religious traditions, interested in their assumptions, beliefs, and practices, I want to flip it around a bit to consider what two traditions, in this case Confucian and Christian thought, might have to say about maintaining a healthy society. In classical Confucianism, and much of Chinese political philosophy across Chinese history, even into the present, it has been assumed that the government or ruler had not only the ability, but also the duty to concern themselves with what we generally consider religious and moral affairs. To be sure, it was their job to deal with floods and roads and taxation, but mainly because the loftier responsibility of a true sage king was to cultivate the conditions of physical and relational well-being conducive to everybody else living sagely too. And so in early Chinese thought, to live well and to operate in accordance with the Tao is captured in the notion de. It's a Chinese character often translated as virtue, but traditionally understood to be a sort of charismatic, attractive power that draws people into moral flourishing. And so a good governor, a good ruler, was one who had this character of de and could attract the people into a truly virtuous and harmonious society. The Analects describes this attractive efficacy like the myriad stars seeming to circle around the pole star, or the grasses swaying under the pull of the wind. Ideally, good governance is easy, moving to bring the best out of people, rather than assuming a fundamental contradiction between the interests of the state and the people. The early Confucians are realistic, though, that this cannot happen when people's basic needs are not met. The classical Confucian Mengzi points out, in years of plenty, most young men are gentle. In years of poverty, most young men are violent. It is not that the potential, the moral potential, heaven confers on them varies like this. They are like this because of what sinks and drowns their hearts, the circumstances. And so this is why the real test of a ruler is whether the society is flourishing enough at every level for virtue to flow. Mengzi insists that the ruler must keep paramount the people's livelihood and avoid extracting it for them and undermining the potential for death. And though it's hard for any community to devote resources to care for the elderly, who are often too weak to earn their keep, let alone earn any privileges of age, Mengzi then goes on to paint a picture of a society where good governance enables even that. He says, if the mulberry trees planted in every small homestead of 5 mu of land, then those who are 50 can wear silk. If chickens, pigs, and dogs do not miss their breeding season, then those who are 70 can eat meat. If each lot of 100 mu is not deprived of labor during the busy seasons, then families with several mouths to feed will not go hungry. Exercise due care over the education provided by the village schools, and those whose heads have turned gray will not be carrying loads on the roads. When those who are 70 wear silk and eat meat, and the masses are neither cold or hungry, it is impossible for their prince not to be a true king. The prince is a true king. So he paints this picture in very specific Chinese cultural terms of what the good, healthy society would look like. And it's a litmus test for whether the sage king is a truly virtuous one or not. Now, while of course the Confucian tradition has gone through enormous transformations over the past millennia, contemporary new Confucians still hold to the sense that governance is supposed to serve a kind of social relational flourishing. For instance, contemporary philosopher Fei Teng at Renmin University, in making a Confucian case for why current governments should concern themselves with the well-being of future generations in the face of the climate crisis, she sees the heart of Confucian virtue ethics residing in the principle of sheng sheng zhi de, the virtue of life generation. And she argues that the test of current generation's spiritual and moral quality is whether they are in keeping with this fundamentally generative character of heaven, tian in Chinese, going forward. We are responsible now for enabling future generations down the road to also be able to cultivate this virtue of life generation. Now, in this way of thinking, the question is really whether spiritual traditions are doing enough to regulate governments and their logics, in the sense of holding them accountable to the task of creating societies where materially and spiritually good life is possible and maybe even encouraged. On this count, both the superpowers of the US and China are facing a major crisis, just as an example, in the falling of their birth rates and populations. In both countries, many young adults are simply not having children or having fewer children on account of extreme housing costs and childcare costs. And this is even more extreme in contemporary China than in the US. And so while a contracting population could ease some environmental concerns, Fei Teng points out that it will create moral quandaries as smaller generations of young citizens face the financial choices and the labor strain of trying to keep much larger populations of the elderly alive. How can we call ourselves ethical, she wonders, if we set up the shrinking cohorts of youth, not even born yet, to face the morally compromised choice of whether to toil their whole lives working in the ever-expanding landscape of expensive nursing homes, or to let the older citizenry die. It is in this context of aging China that we see controversial but increasingly frequent debates about euthanasia. Now, I certainly hope, as we face these challenges ahead, that there can be a plurality of religious and ethical voices to do some deep thinking on this. And indeed, the new Confucians have been among those calling for the government to simultaneously address both the environmental crisis and the demographic crisis, arguing that classic Confucian position that the state cannot afford to stand apart from the people's religio-moral potential. Fei Teng and other new Confucians argue the state has a moral responsibility to set this generation to the moral and spiritual task of making sure the next generation has the natural resources and the economic conditions to cultivate moral and spiritual lives too. Obviously, this is a very different sense of religious freedom than in my opening examples. But I think this is one, the sense of the freedom to live a moral life, the freedom to set up others to live a moral life and therefore meet our own standards for spirituality. I think this sense of religious freedom is one perhaps to set along more limited notions of freedom as merely choice or merely non-interference. Okay, now I'll turn to Christianity. And these are just spotlights. I don't pretend to be doing any justice to either of these traditions. I just want to give you a taste of some of the insights I see as useful. In turning to Christian sources, we see another line of inquiry arise, namely the concern for freedom of conscience, as perhaps of greater importance than the legal categorizations of religion that governments can regulate. The discourse of conscience in the New Testament is a fairly complex one. For instance, in Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, where he walks a nuanced line, on the one hand advising early Jesus followers not to engage in practices against their conscience, but also warning them not to go looking for trouble and navigate all things with a concern for the common good. In 1 Corinthians 10, he's talking about situations where Christians might be politically or socially pressured to eat food sacrificed earlier in pagan temples. And he says this: if an unbeliever invites you to a meal and you want to go, eat whatever is put before you without raising questions of conscience. But if someone says to you, this has been offered in sacrifice, then do not eat it, both for the sake of the one who told you and for the sake of conscience. I am referring to the other person's conscience, not yours. For why is my freedom being judged by another's conscience? If I take part in the meal with thankfulness, why am I denounced because of something I thank God for? In this kind of complex passage, Paul doesn't think that there is anything substantively dangerous about the food. But to consume it knowingly is to implicate the provider and the receiver in what he feels is a breach of integrity. For he goes on to insist there's more to the freedom of Christian faith than having the right to do what one pleases. Paul says in that chapter, you say, I have the right to do anything, but not everything is beneficial. So whether you say, I have the right to do anything, but not everything is constructive. So whether you eat or drink or whatever you do it all for the glory of God. Do not cause anyone to stumble, whether Jews, Greeks, or the Church of God. We see here, in this early Christian community, some attention to the way that right, in the sense of privileges, is not the same thing as right in the sense of faithful integrity. This concern for the integrity of conscience continues to be central in the Christian tradition, also expressed millennia later, in the Catholic Church's Vatican II document on religious freedom, Dignitatis Humanae. So, with some apologies for all the masculine rendering of humanity here, it reads as follows. In all his activity, a man is bound to follow his conscience in order that he may come to God, the end and purpose of life. It follows that he is not forced to act in a manner contrary to his conscience, nor, on the other hand, is he to be restrained from acting in accordance with his conscience, especially in matters religious. What I find interesting about this discourse is that, again, it's not primarily about religious freedom in the sense of demanding some kind of institutional or legal protection to do what one will on religious grounds. In fact, Dignitatis Humanae affirms conscience as something that actually can't be compelled by force. Quote, the truth cannot impose itself except by virtue of its own truth, as it makes its entrance into the mind at once quietly and with power. And this is the great power of the martyr's choice, ultimately more powerful than any state definition. This question of conscience ultimately transcends any definition, requirement, or prohibition. This can be costly, then, for the religious body. For instance, many Catholics for much of the Ming and Qing dynasties would not participate in rites pertaining to the emperor as son of heaven. And this often meant that they could not seek education. For centuries, Chinese Catholics were basically left out of any Chinese formal educational system. But that was not the end be-all for them. Integrity of conscience, in fact, can be maintained in poverty, prison, social exclusion, and even up to death. And I think this can issue a challenge to American Christians and those in countries that offer a strong sense of religious freedom as a protective right and privilege, that religious freedom, where it is sometimes taken as a reason not to have to suffer any costs associated with religious freedom, could be somewhat at odds with the biblical and traditional sense of what this freedom to do one's conscience is really about. Surely the history of Christianity, wherever Christians have been minorities, under the Roman Empire, under the Qing state, under the Japanese invasion, suggests that conscience is that which you do suffer for. So this has been a brief tour through the Confucian and Christian values that I've highlighted for you. But I offer these two notions, the Confucian hope of sagely governance, engendering a sense of attractive moral responsibility throughout society, and the Christian affirmation of a conscience that isn't determined by whatever benefits or structural hurdles happen to be in place, that might relativize or perhaps humanize the technocratic efforts of the modern nation-state to separate religion from the rest of life. I'm not trying to suggest that the US, the UK, France, or China shouldn't proclaim religious freedom in their institutions, nor say that they shouldn't regulate religious activity at all. I think inevitably governments have to engage in dealing with the groups that constitute their populations. But rather, I hope to point to the general unsuccess of trying to posit an ultimate line between civil and religious life, where their values are almost inevitably bound up in each other, and perhaps for the better, if this is where interaction between diverse groups and their insights into ethical and spiritual life might have the greatest influence. Thank you.